Swamiji, before we move to the subject of Sanatan Dharma and India or Bharat, can we first talk a little about the beautiful people and continent of Africa? It is said that Africa was a wealthier and far more civilized place than Europe before the colonial era. Could you please shed light on what Africa was like, materially and spiritually, before Europe essentially devastated it and left it in the state that it is in today?
Okay, very good question. So, before colonization, Africa historically was made up of a combination of diverse empires, kingdoms, federations, small communities. You had nomadic people who would travel and graze their animals. And there were also very diverse languages and religions. For instance, in the northern part of Africa, you have Egypt. And Egypt is well known as being a very, very ancient society. In fact, different people from Greece, Mesopotamia, southern part of Africa, they would all converge in Egypt. And there was not only a place of commerce, but it was also a place of great learning. Architecturally, everybody knows about the pyramids. But what most people don't know is that in the pyramids, that the word pyramid comes from the Greek word pyro, which means fire. Mm-hmm. And mid means in the middle. And daily, the priest would perform havan, fire sacrifices in the pyramids. And so different cultures, they borrowed very much from Egyptian culture. It is said that Egypt also borrowed many of the forms of worship from Bharat. But how exactly this happened, I cannot say. Then south of Egypt, you have another empire, which was even older than Egypt, and that's Nubia. Mm-hmm. It's known as the Kushite kingdom. And the people in the Kushite kingdom, they were very expert in arts, cultures, and also the word Nubia, it comes from the word Nub, which means gold. So they're very, very rich in gold, very, very wealthy kingdom. And then after some time, Nubia actually took over Egypt for some years. And then a little bit south or southeast of Nubia, then you have Aksum. The Aksum kingdom is Ethiopia. What's today Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, that area. And that kingdom was even older than Egypt, which was known as Kemet, and Nubia. And it was one of the four largest empires in its heyday, with Persia, Persia, Egypt, maybe Roman Empire or Greek, and then there was the Aksum Empire. Now, when you go south of the Sahara, then you also have empires. There was Mali Empire. The king, the emperor there, in his time, he was one of, if not the richest person on the planet. That 50% of the gold came from there. And they also had very complex socio-political systems. Going further south to the west, then you have the Kingdom of Ghana. And then also in the west, then you had the Yoruba society. You had those which take up a place, Edo State or Benin, and then you have the Igbo society. The Yoruba society, they also they were smaller communities, but they had chiefs. And in the Igbo society, generally, they did not have a king, but rather they worked with more of a democratic republic type setup, where they would have their council of elders and they would make decisions um, based on the benefit of everybody, and everybody had equal rights. There was no monarch. I'll give you an example. I am from Igbo, the Igbo land. And even though the British had already come during the time of my grandfather was what you would call a chief, but he wasn't formally called a chief, though they would refer to him as a chief. But because he had so much influence, he had so much land, practically half the community, then in their meetings of elders, he was always given the place of prominence, and he was treated like a chief, but he did not have autonomy over everybody else. He was very, very wealthy. He had, in those days, they had polygamous societies. My grandfather had 13 wives. So he would have his house in the middle, and then around his house, there were little houses for each of his wives. And in this way, they live harmoniously. Sometimes I ask my uncles, I mean, how could 50 of you live there harmoniously? And they said it worked. So their societies, it worked for them. It was fluid. And in the midst of all these societies was the spiritual aspect, whether it be in Egypt, Nubia, Aksum, Ghana. In Mali, Islam had come and played a big role. And the Igbo community also, they had their own form of worship. So when we look at civilizations, we tend to think in terms of the economics, how much wealth they had, in terms of the infrastructure of the cities, towns. But I would like to look at it more from a point of perspective of the consciousness of the people. What was the consciousness of the people? In the Vedic scriptures, it's explained that you have the three gunas, tamagun, rajagun, and sattvagun. And that you can understand the level of a person as to how elevated he is in the gunas, to the point that he may even come to the point of Shuddha Sattva, transcendental platform. And it had nothing to do with his material situation, whether he had a lot of wealth, whether he had a lot of material intelligence. It had nothing to do with it. An example, in India, in Bengal, there was a personality. His name was Rupa Goswami. Rupa Goswami, he lived in 1600s. He was the treasurer for the Muslim ruler Nawab Hussain Shah. So he was a multimillionaire. But Rupa Goswami, he left all his wealth and he went to Vrindavan, which is not far from where you are. And there he stayed not in a house, not even a hut, but he would live underneath a tree. And he would go from tree to tree, crying, "Hey Vraje, Lalite Chadevike, hey Nanda Shuno Kuta." That, oh, where's Radhe? Where's Lalite? Where's the son of Nanda Maharaj? And though he was now in a very impoverished situation, practically speaking, he did not have any place to stay. Sometimes he would have a bhajan kutir. Sometimes he was roaming in the forest. But he was held as the most civilized person. He had practically no clothes. But because of the level of his consciousness, then it was taken that this person is really civilized. So there's an ancient, not so ancient actually, there's a saint who lived in the 19th century. His name is Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he said that you can understand the level of consciousness of an individual in 5 stages. He said, first you have Avrita Chaitan. Chaitan means consciousness. Avrita Chetan means covered consciousness. That means like the plants, the trees. Even in Vedic history, we understand that the mountains, the conscious, in Vrindavan, you have Giriraj Maharaj. Have you been there? Govardhan?
I have,
Giriraj
yes.
Maharaj ki jai. So Giriraj Maharaj is not Avrita Chetan. Giriraj Maharaj is fully conscious, totally conscious. But generally, these entities, they are Avrita Chetan because their consciousness is very covered. Then you have Sankuchita Chetan, shrunken consciousness. These are the animals, the aquatics, the birds, that they have the intellect more developed, but they don't have that ability to question about who am I, what is my divine nature, etc. Then you have the human species. The human species takes up the next 3 levels. In Srimad Bhagavatam is stated, Labha sudulabam idam bahu sabante manusyam atadam anityam apihadira. That after many, many lives, says 8 million lives, you have these lower species, then one comes to the human form of life. When you come to the human form, now you can acquire, who am I? What is the purpose of my life? How do I achieve my goal? So the next stage is Mukulita Chetan, means budding consciousness, that somebody is in human form, but they don't inquire. They don't want to know, who am I? Rather, they just engage in eating, sleeping, mating, and defending, and they do not believe in God. They do not believe in divinity. They do not believe in a spiritual aspect. So then their consciousness cannot develop because they have completely blocked that aspect. Then higher than them is Vikachita Chetan. Vikachita Chetan means that it's blossoming consciousness, that now the flower is starting to open, the flower of consciousness, and there's some sweet smell which is coming. Such a person is believing in Dharma. They believe in Supreme. And higher than that is, rather than just going to the temple or going to the mosque, going to the Gurudwara, but now they're starting to inquire and starting to do some sadhana, some practice by which they can cleanse the heart. And the heart, when it becomes fully purified, then they come to the next stage, which is called Puna Vikachita Chetan. Means that the flower has fully blossomed and there's a very, very sweet smell coming. And what is that smell? Prem Bhakti. Prem Dan Vina Vyata Darida Jivan. Dasa Kore Veta Mohe Deho Premadan. That, oh, whatever service I've done, oh Bhagwan, I'm asking only you give me one thing, that you give me prem. That this is the perfection of life. So I want to look at the civilizations based on to what degree are they taking us to prem. And then in that way, we can understand who is really advanced.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.